Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another wonderful Thursday with ThirdPath webinar. I am so glad that everybody is here today. Welcome. This is going to be a really special webinar today. It's one where I feel like I'm going to be the student. Although I have a lot of wisdom about some aspects about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I feel like this is also going to be an opportunity for me to do a lot of learning. I have two incredibly wise women joining us today to bring their expertise to this conversation. And so I feel pretty lucky to have both Tonya Horton and Ostrow joining us. And I'm pretty lucky because they are both board members for the ThirdPath Institute. So welcome. We are going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion today. I'm going to show a couple slides about this concept. How do we think about diversity, equity, inclusion in general? Why is this so important for ourselves, our organizations, our society? And then eventually what we're also going to get into is talking a little bit about how diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is connected to what ThirdPath's been focusing on for so many years, work-life integration. So, if you've been listening in today and over the course of our webinars this year, we've really learned some pretty profound things. The theme of our webinars this year is a world of expanded possibilities. And all year long, we've been looking at the idea that because of the pandemic, which brought a lot of terrible things, it also brought some silver linings. A way for us to really think differently about our workplaces. So in October, we had a webinar that we looked at how we can create more flexible workplaces. And November, we talked about how when we approach work in a more flexible way, we can create a more supportive manager and a new kind of manager. And then in December, we talked about how this is all very connected to wellness and creating workplaces that really support us to live healthier lives. You can look at all of these recordings or just listen to them. If you go to our website, the Thursday with ThirdPath page, and they're all up there for you to hear about. And I mention this because it's all building up to some of the things that you're going to hear about today. So there really is an opportunity for us to think differently about how we approach work and life and to make the most of these changes for ourselves, our families, our communities, our organizations. And in particular, in January, we looked at how remote work can really help improve family well-being. And that, again, raises an issue that we'll be touching on a little bit later in today's webinar, because really flexibility helps us at every stage in the life cycle, whether we're balancing work and family, whether we're balancing work and elder care, whether we're phasing into retirement. And if we're looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion, thinking about inclusiveness around age is really important. Also, remote work and family well-being is connected to what men's role is both at work and at home. And that's something we'll be talking a lot about as we continue into this webinar. So there's a lot of ways that our work is very tied to diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. But there's also a lot of new information we're going to be discussing because of the expertise of both Tonya Horton and Ostrow. With that said, I'm really excited to welcome Tonya to our webinar. She's going to be giving us a big picture view about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and talking about some of the ways that she's been working on these areas herself in much of the work she does today. So I'm just really thrilled to have Tonya join us. It's going to be really a wonderful conversation. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for being on ThirdPath's board. Thank you for doing all the wonderful work you do. You bring so much expertise in all different kinds of ways. I've tapped your expertise because of the work you do around running a remote organization, 800-person remote organization. But today we're going to expand the focus and talk a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Tonya, tell us, why is this important? What's the big picture thinking behind diversity, equity, and inclusion, and welcome.
Hi, Ellen, Jessica. Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here today. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is really important to me and how I ground my work, but also how I ground the work that we do in my organization, because it allows people to really be able to be their best and authentic self in work, and at the same time, bring in all of the other pieces of their work. So you're not having a separate work life and a separate personal life, but you're able to integrate them all when your organization really thinks about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Wow, what a great point to bring your best self, your authentic self to work. That is a great framing around this important topic. So tell us a little bit more. Did you have a couple of slides you wanted to start with, or did you want to talk a little bit about some of the work you are doing right now in your organization around this? Where's a good place to begin?
Yeah, I have some slides that I want to share that will allow us to ground in some shared vocabulary. As we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are a lot of terms that come up with these different sayings. So I want to make sure that as I'm speaking today, that we're all clear on the vocabulary. So starting off with just the big three: diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity is about representation around gender, representation around race and ethnicity, representation around sexuality, and it's infinite in terms of representation. Equity is about outcomes, making sure that your success isn't tied to one of your dimensions of diversity that I just mentioned, that you are able to succeed and it isn't dependent on your race, isn't dependent on your socioeconomic status, it isn't dependent on your access. And then inclusion is about culture and experience. When you are feeling included, you are having a culture and experience that is one that makes you feel like you are a part of that organization. So making sure in your organization that when you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that you define those words. In our organization, we have very specific definitions for each of these terms, and we use these definitions to guide the different parts of our work, to set goals, to set metrics, to make sure that when we have our strategies, it's grounded in diversity, equity, and inclusion. The other word that we're adding to this conversation today is belonging. Belonging is connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion because it's about feeling safe, feeling secure so that you can be your authentic self when you're at work. And there are two other words that I want to lift up for the group today. The other one is justice. We're not going to necessarily talk about justice today, but you're starting to hear justice connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I wanted to lift that word up as well. Justice is about fixing the system so that equal opportunities and access are just a natural part of the system. Right now, unfortunately, inequity is embedded into the system. So to truly have justice, the system would need to be fixed. And then the last word is equality. And I bring that one in because a lot of times when we talk about equity, we're actually talking about and providing people with equality. Equality is making sure that everyone receives the same support regardless of what they need. And that is not always what's best for everybody. Equality is a low bar. Equity is the bar that we want to achieve if we want to have a truly inclusive and diverse environment where everybody can thrive.
Wonderful. Wow. Thank you. So you have been doing something in multiple fronts around these issues that are having, I'm sure, a profound impact. I'm wondering if we want to start with something you and I've talked about in your organization, which has grown significantly. You've done a great job of, in general, figuring out how to do a great onboarding activity in a remote workplace, which, by the way, people need to learn that, period, all by itself. But you've also embedded some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion work into your onboarding process. And and really have thought about how to bring these issues into your organization. Do you want to speak a little bit about? I would think you have a lot of pride in what you guys have figured out around this. So share with us some of the wisdom you've learned around being so thoughtful and intentional around this in your organization.
So our organization, TNTP, is a naturally remote and virtual organization. From our founding over 25 years ago, we were already remote. So the pandemic didn't change a lot for us. But one of the things that we have been able to do and has been really important for us, because over the past 2 years, we grew from a 300-person organization to almost an 800-person organization. So we've had rapid growth during the pandemic. So onboarding became more important than ever. And one of the things that we do for our new staff members, we started about 5 years ago when we were really thinking about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion as an organization, and how could we go from just talking about being a diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization to actually being a diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization. We did a training called Conscious Inclusion, and Conscious Inclusion focuses on race, power, and privilege, and how race, power, and privilege shows up in our organization, which at its very beginning was a majority white organization. We have representation goals to get us to 65% staff of color by 2025, but we were nowhere close to that just 5 years ago. Conscious inclusion sets our foundational language around diversity, equity, and inclusion. It sets foundational language around race, power, and privilege. It sets foundational language around what our values are, what our commitments are. We started off training everybody in the organization on conscious inclusion. And then once everybody was trained, now is a mandatory training for all staff members in the organization. So within your first 6 months, you must go through the conscious inclusion training. That training comes out of my division, and the training is important for all of our new staff members. So one, they know what to expect in our organization, but also they are very aware in the hiring process, our stance on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's something that we talk about in the very last hiring interview. We have a culture interview to help potential candidates determine if TNTP is the right place for them. And then once they come into the organization, we give them more information about how you can expect to experience those things that we talk about in our onboarding interviews. And conscious inclusion is one of the ways that we do that.
Yeah, no, again, I think you guys have become exemplar in how to approach this as an organization. And it looks like it's really, as you pointed out, metrics are part of the process, and it looks like you've really set some metrics and made some incredible strides forward around those metrics. I think one other thing that I remember hearing you talk about, and I'm sure there's other examples, is this idea about, if we just look at some of those words, diversity by representation, equity and outcomes, inclusion, you've talked about, like, you have a lot of, of course, I'm going to blank the name right just now. Groups by
affinity groups.
Affinity groups. Thank you. So you have a lot of affinity groups, and I think that's just one of many examples of how you've thought about how to not just meet your diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, but also build stronger connection across the organization in a remote workplace. Is that a good example of one of the ways that you've kind of made some changes to improve things? Is there another one that you think is a better example?
Groups is a really good example because that's an example of inclusion. That is an example of how we want to make sure that we create a culture where everybody feels included. We started off with 2 affinity groups. We had a staff of color affinity group, and we had a working parents affinity group. As our organization became more diverse, we added affinity groups. So our staff of color affinity group, we still have it, but now we also have a Latinx affinity group, an Asian staff affinity group, an African descent and Black affinity group, Black males affinity group, LGBTQIA plus affinity group, and a faith-based affinity group. And we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion leadership council that I chair, that on the council are representation from all of our affinity groups. So that's an opportunity for them to lift up what's coming up in their individual affinity group meetings, to share these are the things that we want the organization to focus on, but also an opportunity for us as leaders of the organization to say to the affinity groups, these are areas that we would like for you to talk to your membership about. We need feedback on this particular area. Please talk to your affinity groups and bring that information back to us. This has helped us because we take regular twice a year staff engagement surveys. And what the staff engagement survey shows, there's a question that asks, do you feel like you belong in the organization? If you participate in affinity groups, your sense of belonging increases significantly. So we are getting payoff for giving staff the opportunity to be engaged in these groups.
Pretty impressive. The back and forth and how it's helping people and helping your organization. It's so clear that, again, this is just the way of the future, and you guys are actually putting it into action so intelligently and constructively right now. There's lots more we could say about what Tonya's done. What gives you the most pleasure that you're seeing from this work that you've been accomplishing around this area?
That I can actually see the results. When I first joined TNTP 8 years ago, January was 8 years ago, I came in as a partner, and I was one of 2 African-American partners in the organization. When I look at our partner group today, I don't even know how many African-American partners we have, not including the Latinx and the Asian and the other ethnic groups that are represented in our organization. So that's one thing. The representation has increased tremendously. The other thing is 3 years ago, we wrote our accelerating DEI strategy, and we have very clear metrics for each of the 3 years. And we ended our 3 years in December. And what we found, we do take a DEI survey as well. And what we found in that DEI survey is that we moved from an organization that was kindred meaning everything was pretty homogeneous, everybody was thinking, working the same way, and when you were not accepted really in the organization, to an organization that is advanced. Moving from kindred to advanced in 3 years is a significant growth for any organization, but especially for us. So that's one of the things that I'm most proud of, is that not only do we have a strategy, but we have tangible successes and outcomes that we can point to that are continuing to spur us on, because we have by no way achieved. Like, I look at this as a journey. So we are definitely not at the expert level. There's still a lot of growth, but we have made significant progress.
Well, so much to be proud about. It sounds like we could have another call around just understanding those measurables of how an organization is moving along on that spectrum. That could be a whole nother conversation for us to learn about. Really wonderful. I'm going to show a couple more slides just to help us see where we're going next. Again, there is going to be so much brought up today that really is powerful, and we will do our best to keep the conversation going in a good direction, and it's clearly a topic we're going to need to come back to more than once. One of the things that we're going to get to next is starting to build a connection between how work-life integration is also part of our solutions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that, for years, we've always known that if we want to really create more inclusive workplace, it's going to need to support people to work in remote ways or flex or reduced hours, and that we've really, over the course of the years, shown that you can create a successful career following these different approaches, but that's still not the norm out there. And that, what we've really seen is if you want to have time for life, it's not just flexibility, it's also capacity management, how much we're working, so that we have time for these other life responsibilities. I raise this because where we're going next is to hear from Ellen Ostrow, another amazing board member who has, we met many, many, many years ago, could finish each other's sentences when we first met because she's really passionate around so many of the issues that ThirdPath has been exploring for all these years. And she's really been helping people think differently around how to move ahead in a career as a lawyer and what law firms need to do to become more inclusive workplaces. So I really want to welcome Ellen Ostrow to our conversation. Welcome, Ellen. Really good to have you here. Tell everybody a little bit about, you've been on a journey helping individuals, helping law firms around this. Tell us a little about the work you've done and what's made you proud about some of this work.
I'm so glad to be here with you and Tonya today, Jess. Thank you. And I'll start by kind of with the story of where I started. About 23 years ago, I had a psychotherapy practice in downtown DC that happened to be located right in the middle of where all the DC law firm offices are. And my practice was conspicuously filled with women lawyers who were struggling to try to be successful in their law firms. And this was about the same time that I was transitioning from being a psychotherapist to getting my coaching certification. And the issues that I was hearing so resonated for me and my experience as a woman in this culture that I decided that would be the focus of my coaching practice. To think about my work in the context of the constructs that Tonya presented so clearly. At that time in the legal profession, the representation of women and minorities was very sad. And if you look at the statistics and the extent to which things have changed, white women are more represented in the profession than they were before. But people of color, not so much. Very little has changed. And in particular, if you look at who goes to law school, lots of women go to law school. Students of color go to law school and they enter the profession. But with each successive level of advancement, you see their numbers drop off so that the percentages of partners in no way are representative of the people that these law firms serve. In terms of equity, your success very much depends on your identity in most of the legal profession. It was created by and for the white men who built these law firms, and that culture and those systems that disadvantage people who are different persist today. They are not inclusive organizations for the most part. They are organizations that really require people to conform and assimilate into the majority culture. So that for the most part, people who are not white men do not feel psychologically safe. Although I will say that probably most of the white men don't feel psychologically safe there either, because as a profession, they tend to be very armored and guarded. And there's a big separation between who you are at work and who you are outside of work. So my work over the past 23 years has been, I always saw it on two levels. One was a kind of a grassroots level, coaching people who were not majority members to navigate a profession and cultures that had those characteristics, and to be successful despite the challenges. And then on another level, I sort of gave myself a soapbox for speaking and writing, which is, I think, how you and I met, and also to do consulting with organizations that cared about being more diverse and inclusive. And I think there's been a big shift in terms of interest in that since the murder of George Floyd. Although I'm not sure that we're seeing really much significant change.
Yeah, no, it is I mean, listening to Tonya, we can feel very hopeful, very hopeful that there are some organizations that are making great strides forward. But then there's other organizations or whole industries where it feels like the kind of change required is glacially slow in change. And so there's such a range out there, really, of how things are going. Well, again, when you reflect, we will talk about the barriers in a second, and we'll hear from both of you guys about what are some of the challenges still around the work that you're doing. But maybe to start on the positive, what are some things that you feel in this history that you've given the world, the work you do? What are some things you feel proud about that have that you've contributed to some change around here? What comes to mind?
A number of years ago, my colleague Carl Cooper, who you also know, and I worked with the law firm of Beveridge and Diamond. I can use their name because we've already presented about this at conferences. They were an entirely white partnership, with the exception of one African-American partner. And they had at their firm retreat an African-American client, very well known, who looked out at the audience and said, "If you all look like this next year, you're not going to get any more of my business." And Carl and I worked with the firm over a protracted period of time to become more diverse and inclusive. And one of the most wonderful things that happened was that Ben Wilson, who now has become quite famous for his work in advancing African-American attorneys all over the country, he became the chairman of the firm. And with his leadership, the firm became a very different place. And Ben is kind of, I'm in awe of him. He has just retired. He continues to do incredible work. And we're very proud of getting them started in that direction. But I have to point to Ben's leadership, because you can't do this kind of work unless you have that kind of leadership. The other thing that I feel happy and excited and encouraged about is the success of so many of the attorneys that I've coached. And now seeing them in as partners in law firms, as successful in corporate legal departments, taking up positions of leadership. And I think that just speaks to their determination and resilience.
Yeah. Well, and as we're trying to make change, especially in industries or organizations where there is less support, it does create, having support in your corner to keep on keeping on makes a big difference. And again, that as people listen in today, you're from probably a wide range of organizations. Some are more supportive, some are less supportive. And so, if we take one thing away today, getting some support to keep on being your real self at your workplace and finding a way to do that, you can continue and it will make a difference, but you need some support in places that are a little bit less supportive. Well, what you can really hear from both of your stories is how much leadership really does make a difference, right? So, Tonya, listening to your story, you had the top of the organization committing to something and, being very intentional about how to map out next steps to make a change. And Ellen, your story also shows that when you finally do have leadership that gets it, it really can make a big difference. So obviously, we know that the right leader or the right leaders is critical to change. Is there something else that either one of you wants to add that you think is important to help people make some next steps? One of the things that Tonya and I talked about is what agency do we have to make a next step happen for ourselves around this? And then I want to talk a little bit about, and what are some of the big barriers? Who would like to take a stab at either the agency or the barriers concept?
I'll take a stab at agency. I think we have agency in a couple of ways. The more educated we are about different cultures and what gets in the way of our ability to interact effectively with people who are different from us. Because what happens is that we're most comfortable with people who are similar to ourselves. And we need to learn how to be mindful of the anxiety and the stereotypes that come up for us that become interpersonal barriers in forming relationships that are characterized by mutuality and mutual support. So that's something that we can learn. And that can help us be much more effective in advocating for people who are different from us in our workplaces, advocating for ourselves if we can understand. If I'm a mother of two young kids, and the extent to which I understand the stereotypes that come up for other people, when they look at me, empowers me to navigate that. Understanding the true value that diversity brings to our lives and our professional spaces, so that we can be advocates, learning how to be allies, real allies to people who are different from us, learning how to interrupt bias when we see it in ways that are effective. I think we can have a greater agency in all of those arenas. And it just takes education and practice and making sure that you don't live in a monocultural world. If everybody around you is the same, that's not a good place to start from. You need to start changing that.
Yeah. Wow. Such a good list. Thank you, Ellen. Tonya, what would you like to add? We've just really hit some really important points around some agency ideas.
Yes, I agree with everything that Ellen said about agency. The other thing that I would add to what she shared is understanding where we are in terms of our privilege and in terms of our power. We all have some modicum of privilege and some modicum of power. And if we truly want to be allies, we have to recognize how that shows up and how we are engaging with others, especially others that aren't like us. The decisions that we make, the behaviors that we have, the things that are concerning to us, taking some time to interrogate why that is when we're feeling uncomfortable, thinking about what is it about this decision made me uncomfortable, and then acting on that. And then recognizing that organizations, just like countries, just like communities, are a collection of people. And if you in that organization, you have an agency and a responsibility to impact change. If you see something that's not working, it is part of your responsibility as a member of that community to say something. And if the situation is so bad, then making the decision to remove yourself from that situation or do everything that you can to correct that situation. I think it's really important.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to add one. I wonder if you guys think this, I'm thinking too simply here, but to me, I sometimes it boils down to time and making sure we commit to doing something and creating time for this. If this is important to you, how are you going to commit to this and create time and energy to focus on this in your life, to educate yourself, to not be in a monoculture? It does actually, I mean, Tonya's organization didn't make change without actually committing some time and resources to those changes, and people who committed to those resources. Well, again, we've got a lot of topics we want to kind of touch on today. This is definitely something we want to come back to. I want to make sure we get to the connection between work-life integration and diversity, equity, inclusion. But before we get there might be just one barrier that you really feel is important for people to be thinking about as they're making a commitment to be more involved, more engaged with diversity, equity, inclusion ideas. Any barriers you want to put on the table?
The one barrier that is standing out to me just from our conversation is the metrics, like knowing your numbers, knowing how diverse your organization is, knowing how equitable, knowing how inclusive your organization is. Oftentimes we make assumptions, but there are tools, a multitude of tools available to be able to do assessments of your organization and also of you as individual. So taking advantage of those tools so you know where you're starting from so that you can measure your progress. And oftentimes I'm saying it's a barrier because oftentimes that doesn't happen. We'll just do random acts of DEI and expect things to change, but we're not even targeting what the change is that we want to see.
Wonderful.
And I would add to that accountability. You know, as a coach, one of the key levers that for change is accountability, because, you know, all of us, from New Year's resolutions to, you know, all kinds of things, you know, we have great intentions, but because of time constraints, because of busyness, because of the distractions of life, we tend not to follow through. So on an individual level, accountability is crucial. On an organizational level, accountability is crucial. There are many organizations, particularly in the legal space, doing what I love Tonya's phrase, random acts of DEI, with no accountability. And, you know, the way I think about this is kind of like with climate change. You know, if you have a short view, if you are only looking at what's right in front of you, then none of these things matter. You're perfectly fine. But the fact is that just like we're moving toward a climate disaster, we do live in a world filled with people who bring all different kinds of talents and strengths. And organizations can think that they're doing fine the way that they are, but it requires a long view to make a commitment to seeing that. Look at the world around you. Look at the talent coming through the pipeline. You're going to have to take another look at how you function as an organization if you're going to take advantage of that, or otherwise you're going to be left behind.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Wonderful. So, you know, using some of the tools that are out there to create a more thoughtful, planned approach, and then, you know, having some accountability to see that you're actually making some progress around those goals that you've set, and the use of those tools. Again, not that there isn't more to say about all of these things. You know, I want to talk a little bit about how is diversity, equity, and inclusion linked to an integrated approach to life. I certainly have a lot of opinions about this. It's funny, when I was getting ready for today's webinar, it's a phrase I haven't used for a long time, but it's that concept of the ideal worker. And, for years we talked about that the ideal worker was someone who could put work first their entire careers. And that really reflected white men. And that it really was not the bulk of the workforce, and nor, I hope, the bulk of white men today, that we really are living more lives that include many other parts of ourselves and wanting to have time for those parts of ourselves, family being one very important part of them. So, I've got lots of thoughts about how diversity, equity, and inclusion is connected to integrated approach to work and life. But before I blab on, there might be something you guys want to share about this concept before I share a couple of thoughts. Do either of you have any immediate stories you want to share or ideas around these blending of these two concepts?
If Tonya's not going to jump in right away, I certainly will. Jessica, it makes me think about our first conversation, because the ideal worker is still in the legal world is still the ideal worker you're talking about. Recent research looking at wellness, well-being among attorneys has found that women and attorneys of color suffer more from mental health kinds of issues within the organizations than do the white men who work there. And so, it really kind of brings to the fore the point that we are human beings. We don't have like a part of us that's a work person and a part of us where, our physiology, our nervous systems, it's all one thing. And if we can't figure out how to make work for human beings, not just for a small subset of them, then, that's what ThirdPath is working toward, is how can we create organizations that support integrated lives? Otherwise, workplaces will only have ideal workers in them.
Yes, yeah. And it feels like it's still such a journey, although there, again, like starting with Tonya helps us understand this journey is possible, but getting people to think bigger about what does a worker look like and what do they bring when they bring their whole self to work, what does that really mean, and how do we really support them, given that they can, it's a constantly changing, who that whole self is changing over time too. And so it is a really different kind of thinking than this very static assumption that you just are a worker and you can put life separate from you. Tonya, when you listen in, is this something that you see some connection between, you have thoughts about this connection between integration and diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yes. What you all were talking about makes me think of, as we are becoming just a more diverse society, and as we talk about wanting to have more diversity in our organizations, it requires that our organizations change the way we operate so that this diversity can thrive in the organization. If your organization is kindred, very homogeneous, and everybody is alike and everybody is the quote unquote ideal worker, then your organization is going to thrive and there's not going to be any issues and there are not going to be a lot of complaints. Once you start adding in different dimensions of diversity, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's race, whether it's sexuality, whether it's socioeconomic status, whatever it is, as you start to add that into the organization starts to feel tension. And the tension is those new people can't work and don't want to work under those traditional constraints. They don't want to work a typical 8 to 5 where they have to go in the office every day and they have to be checked every day. because their life requires them to be able to do something different. And if our organizations aren't going to, right now, take the lessons that we should have learned from the pandemic and that we should have learned about the ability to be able to work remote and apply them to life post-pandemic, then we're going to find that people are going to take advantage of the Great Resignation, and they're going to go to places where they can be their authentic selves. And that's, as we think about having diverse organizations, that is one of the things about diversity. Once you get to a critical mass of diversity in your organization, it puts pressure on the organization to respond differently. And if you don't respond differently, the people will leave, the diversity will leave, and you'll have this constant revolving door of staff members in and out of your organization because your system hasn't changed. You're saying, I want a diverse organization, but what I really want is people to come in who look different on the outside, but on the inside that we're all the same and we're all going to do just like our previous employees have for the past 30 years. And that's just not realistic.
Yeah, it's not. And again, it's back to this leadership role. You know, if one of the things that we've talked about for a long time at ThirdPath, if you have leaders who only see that you can move ahead by putting work first, they're going to have that narrow perspective around this, diversity by how we get work done, because they've only worked a certain way. That's one reason why we've gotten stuck in some of the old way of thinking, even after a pandemic, is because leaders worked on site, put work first and worked on site, and they think that's just the way we need to go back to. Is that was a great solution. Let's go back to that. It worked for me. Let's make it work for everybody else again. And when really they're missing an opportunity of thinking so differently around how we can get our work done. There was one story in particular that I thought was so interesting, Ellen, when we were talking about some of these issues. You know, without naming names, it was so interesting to hear that for a law firm, it was almost more possible to imagine some diversity, equity, inclusion issues than to imagine part-time work. And that the idea that someone would actually work less than full-time at some point was just beyond the place that they would ever consider. And again, we're not imagining a future where that's what everybody wants to do, but when we include it as one of the options, it means that when we have elder care, we have a little bit more wiggle room to take care of elder care. We can phase into retirement as opposed to just exiting the workplace. If we're balancing work and the care of a new baby, it really does help to have a little bit more breathing room. So I just thought it was so interesting that that was the place where they were like, I can't go there. That's just not part of the future I can imagine. Can you speak to that at all? Is that still a major barrier out there?
It's a huge barrier. I mean, the industry now accommodates reduced hours, but the stigma attached to it is profound and really blocks the success of so many, particularly women. Certainly not only women. And I'll just compare two stories. So I was recently speaking to a litigator, a white male litigator, who was saying, this work is just not for everybody. And if you want to reduce your hours and take care of your kids part of the time, then this just isn't the career for you, because you're not learning, you're not working on the right cases, you're just not going to be able to be successful. And I contrast that with another very senior litigation partner at a completely different firm who had a woman attorney who had 2 young children, and she was sharing care with her husband. And her husband then was called this was at the time of the war in Iraq. And so he was sent to Iraq. And this senior white male lawyer said, she's a very talented attorney. She has to leave to take care of her kids. She's single parenting. I am going to make sure that she can be successful because she's just too talented to lose. And he did. And she's now a partner at the firm. So, it's possible, it's impossible. Which is it?
Certainly can see in that story how possible it is if we have the right people rooting for us and thinking at the top in new ways. I want to put out here one other idea, and then we're going to open it up for questions in a second, unless Tonya has one more thing she wants to add before we open it up for questions. I'm hoping in a couple of months in one of our webinars, we're going to have the author of this amazing book called Shorter join us. And he's done research with over 100 organizations where they are either working a 4-day work week or a 32-hour work week. And most importantly, they are giving people pay so they can afford to work those 4-day work weeks or 32-hour work weeks. And what they're seeing is when you make a change across the board in an organization to do this, it addresses all of these issues we're raising today, because you really are creating a workplace where more diverse people can come and bring their whole selves to life because they have enough time outside of work to be able to take care of their lives as well. And so I think there really is something around us getting smarter around how much work can we handle in a world where people come as a worker plus something else. And I'm hopeful that just as we see in Tonya's organization taking great strides forward around some diversity, equity, inclusion measurements and goals, that we will see organizations get smarter and smarter about how to really support people to have time for their lives, and it will pay back big dividends for those workplaces. Tonya, there might be a thought that you want to share about this topic before we open it up, and if you have a question you want to ask any of the speakers today, go ahead and put it in the chat. We will read your question as part of our discussion in a second. Before we get to closing of this wonderful discussion we're having today. Tonya, any other thoughts you want to share on this blending of diversity, equity, inclusion, and work-life integration?
I want to share a term that I just read about this week called radical flexibility. And it talks about the idea that organizations and workers are really looking for a variety of different ways to be able to do their work, whether it's part-time, whether it's seasonal, whether it's temporary. And as an organization, thinking about what this radical flexibility really mean, especially now as people are starting to figure out what's next for them, it's really important to think about the idea of having a contingent workforce. At our organization, we allow for the traditional workday. You can also have a 60% work time, or you can be with us seasonal, you can be with us temporary. Our contingent workforce is about 200 people. And we made an intentional effort in our last strategic plan to say we wanted to increase our contingent workforce because we knew that as a remote organization, we could do that. We could give people that flexibility. And it's been amazing how many people have come to us for those different types of work opportunities. We're not as radical as the article that I read about, but it is something that we can aspire to. Yeah.
And again, just like what you're doing is your organization's kind of upping the bar of what's possible. These organizations embracing these ideas is expanding how what employees can expect and leave to go find if they're not getting at the place that they're at. So really great. Wonderful to hear that term, radical flexibility. I like it. All right, so we're checking to see if anybody put a question out there in the chat box for our wonderful speakers. As you can tell, ThirdPath is very lucky to have both Tonya and Ellen as board members. I feel humble listening in today's conversation and feel like there's still so much as a student that I need to learn around these issues, and it's been really a pleasure There might be a question out there. I'm going to just check in with Lindsay if she's heard from the audience today about a question. No problem. Sometimes it takes a little while for people to think about something that they want to ask our speakers today. And, again, I hope what you've really seen in all of our webinars this year is that there really is a world of different possibilities around the future of our organizations and how profound that can be in the kind of where we go to work and how that can be an extension of us being our whole selves and living a good life. And then how we can bring that back then to our own communities and families. There is a lot of opportunity here. Still a lot of barriers, still a lot of organizations that are stuck, a lot of people that are stuck, but a lot of opportunities here too. So Lindsay, just double checking that there isn't one more question out there, and then I'll explain what we're going to do next. All right. I want to thank everybody for being here today. I knew that I would learn a lot, and I did. To me, also, I realized this is something I just want to keep on coming back to as part of our webinars and exploring more deeply. Thank you, everybody, for participating today and sharing your questions. We got another great webinar planned for April, so tune back in. Ellen, I want to just thank you so much for all that you do for ThirdPath as a board member, all the work that you're doing in the law industry and for helping people really think differently. Any last thought you want to share with our audience today as they listened into this great conversation?
I'm very proud to have been on the board of ThirdPath since you invited me to do that when you first started the board. And I'll just end with how much ThirdPath gives me hope, because you're constantly coming up with more and more solutions and tools to help people create time for their lives and to help leaders lead in ways that allow for that for themselves and the people they employ. So I'll just say bravo to ThirdPath.
Thank you, Ellen. What a nice way to hear some positive words from such a wonderful person who's made such a difference for us. Tonya, we are so glad you are a part of our board now, too. Thank you so much for sharing your inspiring story and what you have been doing with your organization. I just feel like I'm going to keep on learning so much from you. Any last words that you have for our listeners today?
Well, first, just thank you for having me here. I echo what Ellen said about bravo to ThirdPath, and to you, Jessica, for lifting up this very important topic as a part of Thursdays with ThirdPath. It is a great opportunity to be able to share the work that's happening in my organization, but also that ThirdPath provides this opportunity and this platform. So everybody who's listening, encourage you to learn more about ThirdPath and to think about your own agency in your organization.
Wonderful, wonderful. I really want to thank you both. And like I said, I really think this is a topic that we can come back to many times and explore in different ways. I'm actually going to listen to this webinar again once it's out on recording, because Tonya did a great job explaining the big picture concepts. And the list of agency ideas that you suggested, Ellen and Tonya, are really inspiring about some next steps we can all take. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you being here today. Wonderful webinar.